Okay, good afternoon. We'd like to get our final session underway. The title is AB 32 and the Political Economy of Climate Change Legislation. Our moderator is Professor Dan Sperling from UC Davis and the California Air Resources Board. Dan Sperling is a professor of civil engineering and environmental science and policy, and he is the founding director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis. He holds the automotive engineering seat on the California Air Resources Board, and he has been instrumental in designing and implementing a series of greenhouse gas policies. Recently, Dan was awarded a very prestigious Heinz Award for his leadership and research on clean fuel alternatives. Professor Sperling.
Thank you very much, Colin. So we've been designated as the real world panel. I think we take that as a compliment, but I'll leave that to my fellow panel members as to how much of a compliment it is. But I do want to say, let me start out with just a few introductory comments. First of all, I thought in the last panel there was a lot of discussion about market approaches and second best solutions and so on. Having spent much of my career studying policies and now becoming a policymaker as a board member of the Air Board, I've observed this process in which we've gone, many of our policies and approaches to reduce pollution in particular started out very much in a regulatory mode, especially with pollution. And they were very much in the model of being crafted by lawyers, black and white, or even engineers, no gray areas here. And some people would derogate or would refer to using kind of a Stalinist expression of command and control. But it's evolved over time, and if I use the Air Resources Board as a case study, it's really evolved from being very sophisticated, very accomplished, very focused on very specific rules and regulatory instruments to moving towards more flexible instruments that are more performance-based and even market-based. And it's been an evolution over time, and I think it's a very interesting one to observe, and I think it reflects the larger sense of how we are dealing with externalities in our society. So in this session, let me suggest that one of the things we're going to do is look at the role of different kinds of policy instruments, market instruments versus regulatory instruments. And I would note in saying that there's all this fury about cap and trade as part of our climate policy in AB 32. Cap and trade only accounts for about 20% of the planned reductions from AB 32. Most of the reductions are coming from all of these other instruments. Another thought is that, and something that this panel I think will be good at addressing, is the role of the different interest groups, stakeholders if you wish, and their influence on the process. And it's important and interesting to understand that California is different than other places. Every place is unique, but in California, for instance, we don't have a coal industry. And that has played a huge role in what California has been able to do in terms of crafting climate policies. And a third point I want to address is that to a large extent, what we're talking about here is the relationship between science and policy, or the role of science in policy. And when I say that, when we take science and move it to policy, it really means broadening it out, making it covering a lot more topics and disciplines. It means looking at what's most efficient, what the Economist would talk about, what's most effective, what others might talk about. It involves looking at what is most equitable, and equitable not just by income group, but across industry, across companies. legal constraints that we'll be talking about. And a big part of it is just how do you operationalize these ideas in science and academia in the real world? And I would just I would note that, us academics, for this moment, I'll leave my academic hat on. Us academics really need to be have much more humility, have much less hubris in how we approach it. And I give you just one little illustration of that. I was involved a few years ago in helping design the low carbon fuel standard for California. And I went into it and I said, look, I've studied alternative fuels for 30 years, life cycle analysis methods. I know the industries. I know the environmental community. I mean, I know at least 90% of what I need to know to design this policy instrument. And in the end, I probably knew 10% of what I needed to know. And that's because when you get into the real world, you're dealing with questions of, well, do the data really exist? Are the data available? Are the methods available that can be used that are transparent and easy to use? What about the equity issues I just mentioned? Not necessarily equity across income groups, but equity across industries, equity across companies. And what are the legal issues? We got into WTO issues. I mean, that was the last thing I thought I would have to know about. But indeed, we had to understand what were the international implications of creating emission standards that went upstream and therefore were relevant to Brazil and Asia and so on. So with those introductory thoughts to motivate this discussion, we have three really superb speakers, all with very different areas of expertise and interest and experience. And I think we're going to leave time. We'll make sure we have some good discussion, both among the panel and with the audience. And so with that, our first speaker is Matthew Kahn. He's a professor at the UCLA Institute of the Environment, the Department of Economics, and the Department of Public Policy, all at UCLA. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Before joining UCLA 3 or 4 years ago, he taught at Columbia and at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He's the author of numerous books. The most recent is Climate-Topolis: How Our Cities Will Thrive in the Hotter World. And I would note he's played a very important role in reviewing the Air Resource Board's economic analyses of AB 32. And he's going to be talking about building coalitions for climate change legislation.
Folks, thank you for inviting me. It's been a very interesting day, and I hope 12 minutes of excitement. But you judge. I'm going to talk about a couple of papers of mine that have some fun facts and hopefully relevant facts on the political economy of AB 32. I hope you find these papers interesting. What I'd like to walk you through is some empirical work I've done on the Waxman-Markey bill of June 2009, who supports congressional carbon regulation. I'm going to turn to my exciting work on Google. Do recessions chill interest in global warming? And then finally, perhaps talk briefly about this new paper of mine with Aaron Manser, on this important issue of leakage and how the manufacturing sector might be affected by carbon pricing, and show you a couple, talk through and wave my hands on some things that we've learned from the statistical models that we've been estimating, and throw out some questions all related to the political economy of who supports AB 32. So you can't read this, but what I want you to see here is in work with Mike Craig, what we've been studying is the U.S. Congress's propensity, who in the Congress does a Nancy Pelosi and votes in favor of battling climate change. And in our work, we look at a bunch of different measures, whether it's mandatory limits on greenhouse gas emissions, columns 1 and 2, who supports a renewable portfolio standard, voting for tax credits for renewable energy, or in columns 7 and 8, the American Clean Energy Security Act. What comes across consistently in our statistical models is we can explain, and this will shock you. Why does Nancy Pelosi vote in favor of carbon mitigation legislation? We find that a simple three-factor model does a very good job. Congressional districts that are richer, whose representative is more liberal based on the thousands of votes cast in the US Congress, and those districts that have a low carbon emissions per capita. Folks, this third measure comes from the Vulcan data set from Kevin Gurney's team at Purdue University. For every congressional district, for every county in the US, you can download data on the year 2002 per capita carbon emissions. And so for folks who love econometrics, what we're showing is, all else equal, representatives vote in favor of carbon mitigation if they're richer, if they're more liberal on an ideology scale, and if their district is cleaner, of lower carbon per capita carbon emissions. And so as we think about support for AB 32 within the state, I would think that this model could go pretty far for predicting levels of support. And this is the beginnings of political economy of building a carbon coalition. Prop 23 and the business cycle. I love bad jokes, and I apologize, but they keep me awake in the late afternoon. The conventional wisdom is that environmentalists like recessions. If all 300 million people in the US just meditated all day long, we would have very little pollution. Tough crowd. We, like my students at UCLA. And so this is this scale argument that Meredith alluded to before. If we want green economy, let's just scale it down and all take a sleep. But what Matt Cochin of Yale and I argue in a new paper that you can download for free, so maybe that's its value. Is that greens, when we want to battle externalities, we actually need government to step in and pass laws. And bullet point number 2, recessions may chill interest in tackling medium-term challenges. We're so fixated on the economy and the business cycle right now that we may lose focus on medium-term issues. Folks, believe me if I told you that Rush Limbaugh talked about this paper on his radio show 3 weeks ago and attacked me for over 2 minutes, saying, and people have told me this is the highlight of my career. And they may be right. So again, what Matt Cochin and I document, so let's talk this through and then we'll double back to Rush Limbaugh. You can use Google Insights to count up how much search activity people are searching for. So type my name into Google Insights and not much will come back. Type in Lady Gaga and you'll be amazed what comes back starting in the year 2008. We collected data for each state in each week from January 2004 until the present on the volume of search activity for people searching for global warming and searching for unemployment. Folks, ignore that second row with the carry. The key point is the unemployment rate. In those states, in those months within those states where the unemployment rate was rising, people were searching for the word unemployment. This positive coefficient of 0.238, I'm sorry, of 0.122 in the fourth column. In column 3, the coefficient of 0.06. I understand my own work. To say that again, people, when the unemployment rate in your state month is rising, based on column 3, people are searching for unemployment, but they're less likely to be searching for global warming. This was our new empirical work that people are not in the mood to talk, at least through revealed preference. They're not searching for global warming. This was our measure of concern. And for people who support AB 32 and hope that Prop 23 fails in November, this is the challenge of how you keep people in the mood in the midst of a recession. And what Rush Limbaugh attacked us for was he said that we were making fun of the common man. And I don't make fun of the common man. I was trying to document. I'm a Homer Simpson myself. We were trying to document here, what are the facts? What are the positive facts? What are people searching for over the business cycle? And the facts are the facts, and we did not make a normative statement about them. Folks, in my past work with John Matsusaka and alone, I have studied who votes in favor of environmental legislation when it's these binding California referenda. I find consistent evidence that more educated people vote in favor of green legislation. There's political economy evidence, and this won't shock you, that those areas whose livelihoods are affected by the regulation tend to vote against it. We find a kind of funky income effect, this inverted U, that middle-class people are the most, all else equal, middle-class people are the most likely to vote in favor of this green legislation relative to the poor and the rich. Final piece I want to talk about today is carbon pricing and job loss. And I think the easiest way to explain my paper, since I barely understand it, is to look at this exciting diagram. Folks, I am not one of the world's greats with PowerPoint. What I wanted to show you was two adjacent counties. So think of Los Angeles County and Riverside. The ideal that Erin Manser of Dartmouth and I are trying to achieve, but we're not always able to achieve this, is imagine if each county was in its own electric utility district. What we would, and that's not always the case, we want to look at border pairs and ask, does energy-intensive manufacturing cluster on the side of the border where electricity is cheap? Folks, this is not rocket science. Walk across a political boundary and you're still in the same local labor market, you're still in the same climate zone, but you can have cheaper electricity if you walk across this political line. So what Erin Manser and I do in this new study of ours is we take a look at employment in manufacturing in industries that are highly energy intensive, like primary metals, versus low energy intensive, like food, and we study whether you see whether jobs in the energy-intensive categories are systematically clustering on the cheap side of the border. And while there is, and this speaks to carbon pricing in the following way, if Arizona does not join the Western Climate Initiative, and if California does, and if electricity prices go up, how many jobs would jump at the border is what we're trying to speak to. And while we do find that energy-intensive manufacturing, such as the ones I list in the bottom bullet point, are sensitive to electricity prices, the effect just isn't that large. And in fact, because California's emissions factor is low, as previous talks have alluded to, we don't believe that carbon pricing would raise electricity prices that much. In fact, in our preliminary estimates, it's these states in the Midwest who we think would be suffering more of the job loss. But as of right now, this is speculative. But I want to bring out that microeconomists are useful people in testing the plausible hypothesis that there could be job leakage. But at least as of right now, I don't believe it's going to be large. Conclusion. With the failure of global carbon policy at Copenhagen and Waxman-Markey, we still face this global free rider problem. The reason I support AB 32 is we need somebody to step up and be a guinea pig. I think that President Obama should reward California for stepping up and playing this role. There's the fascinating green economy issue of if you're a first mover in a world full of free riders, are you a hero or a sucker? And I think we're a hero, but as an economist, and as a California homeowner, I'd like a transfer from the president for the experimentation and the knowledge that our experiment will bring out. Thank you.
Well, I'd say it's real world when you get Lady Gaga, Rush Limbaugh, and Nancy Pelosi in one talk. So our next presenter is Richard Frank. He's Executive Director of the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at UC Berkeley, School of Law, where he teaches courses in environmental law, climate change, and public interest litigation. This year, he's spending the time at UC Davis and teaching similar courses, and we'd sure like to keep him a little longer. Rich is not just an academic. Before going to UC Berkeley, Rick practiced law with federal and state agencies for 32 years, most of that time with the California Department of Justice, and he was eventually promoted to serve as California's Chief Deputy Attorney General for Legal Affairs. Among his many appointments and committee assignments and service, he did serve with the Economic Allocation Advisory Committee for AB 32 for ARB, and that's the one that looked at the cap and trade issues. Mr. Frank earned his JD from the UC Davis School of Law and his BA from UC Santa Barbara. Rick is going to talk about his widely disseminated report on Proposition 23 and AB 32. Rick, nice to have you here.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you and the Foundation for inviting me to appear here today. And yes, most of my presentation is going to revolve around a study that my center published last month out of UC Berkeley, and of which I was a co-author. It's entitled California at the Crossroads, Proposition 23, AB 32, and Climate Change. And if you're interested, it's accessible through the UC Berkeley School of Law's website through a link there. Well, what I'd like to do in my formal remarks is talk a little bit about recent California political history, which is also where I'm going to end up, and in the middle talk about AB 32 and about Proposition 23. Let me start by talking about California's role both as a greenhouse gas emitter and also as an air quality and climate change policy leader. As you probably have heard, and depending on the foreign exchange rate, California, if an independent nation, would be somewhere between the 5th and 8th largest economy in the world. If considered as an independent nation, California is the 19th largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. Just file that away for the moment. We'll come back to it. I want to talk a little bit about leadership, particularly in the air quality area. In the 1950s and 60s, California was really pioneering efforts at control and reduction of conventional air pollutants, and that leadership was recognized by the United States Congress in 1970 when Congress created the first iteration of the Modern Clean Air Act at the federal level, when it granted California and only California the authority to continue to that leadership when it comes to vehicular sources of air emission, and gave a so-called carve-out for California to adopt, implement, and enforce vehicular sources of air emission controls more stringent than those adopted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and adopted nationwide. Fast forward to 2002, when which was not the year of California's first greenhouse gas climate change related laws, but up until then the most important, the so-called Pavley legislation, AB 1493, was passed, in which the California legislature directed the California Air Resources Board to enact and implement and enforce the first mandatory greenhouse gas emissions standards for vehicular sources anywhere in the world. In 2006, 4 years ago, of course, the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed by the California legislature, AB 32, with the strong support of Governor Schwarzenegger. And again, that's the first state law in the nation setting binding greenhouse gas emission targets for a political jurisdiction. And so there was a focus, I think the public was focused on climate change and global warming issues in 2006, and then the public got understandably distracted by other issues, including a looming recession in intervening years. And it's not until 2010, this fall, with the qualifying of Proposition 23 on the California general election ballot, that climate change as a policy and economic and environmental issue is again front and center before the public at large. And it's really that intermix of factors that our study, California at the Crossroads, is intended to address. First of all, and I'm assuming that folks are generally aware of Proposition 23 and the fact that it would suspend operation and implementation of AB 32 until California achieves a jobless rate at or below 5.5% for 4 consecutive quarters. And the proponents of Proposition 23 talk about this as just an intermediate temporary suspension needed to get through the current recession. As our study points out, though, what really amounts to, in all likelihood, is more of a de facto repeal of AB 32, and that is because in the 36 years that California has been maintaining unemployment statistics, the threshold required to recommence AB 32 for consecutive quarters of unemployment at or below 5.5% has only been achieved 3 times in the state's history. So it is the exception rather than the rule. So it is unclear when, if ever in the foreseeable future, if Proposition 23 passes, it would be restarted once again. The key finding of our white paper, is that Proposition 23, if enacted by the voters this November, would have a number of important and, in many respects, unforeseen consequences. First is regulatory uncertainty. One of the key points that we think is worth noting is that while Proposition 23 would suspend the implementation of AB 32, it does not extend or suspend the statutory deadline created by the legislature for a rollback of state aggregate greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020 to 1990 levels. That deadline remains in effect and is not altered by the initiative. What the measure would do, however, is constrain and prevent state and local governments in California and the private sector from taking the steps necessary to achieve that level of aggregate reduction. It would eliminate the tools and the timing both. I was interested in the representative from SMUD who spoke on the last panel talking about the perceived need of his utility, I think by extension utilities in general and the business community in general, for certainty and predictability in their planning activities. And it's precisely that lack of certainty and predictability that Proposition 23 would create. Another thing our study demonstrated or revealed was that Proposition 23, if enacted, is likely to create additional and disproportionate burdens on some sectors of the California economy while giving substantial relief to others. A couple of examples: the developer community, real estate developers, would still be, if Prop 23 passes, constrained and required to implement a variety of greenhouse gas reduction reform efforts through SB 375, major legislation passed 2 years ago. Similarly, I mentioned the Pavley legislation from 2002. Auto manufacturers, regardless of what happens to Proposition 23, are going to be required to comply with that measure in the years to come as a result of that legislation mandating tailpipe reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, Proposition 23 does essentially relieve several other sectors in the California economy from greenhouse gas reduction responsibilities, primarily among them the oil and gas industry and electrical utilities. One of the things that's been one of the challenges about Prop 23 that has been most heavily publicized is the likely and negative impact it would have on California's burgeoning renewable energy and green tech sectors, and I'll return to that in a moment. A key focus of our study has been on, if 23 passes, what remains in effect in terms of California's portfolio of policy and legal initiatives to address climate change, and which would be suspended. What we do know is that some regulatory measures, including the low carbon fuel standard pioneered by Professor Sperling, would likely be suspended. The cap and trade program that the Air Resources Board has been working on for the last 2 years would not be allowed to go forward. Even, and this is something that hasn't been well understood or publicized, even the current requirement that emitters of greenhouse gases to report their level of greenhouse gas emissions is currently mandated by the Air Resources Board under AB 32 authority would be, that authority would be eliminated. Additionally, Prop 23 would undoubtedly create some uncertainty as to the legal effectiveness of some initiatives. Again, returning to the low carbon fuel standard, I think a good argument can be made that if 23 were to pass, that ARB could rely on its independent pre-existing statutory authority, separate and apart from AB 32, to promulgate and enforce a low carbon fuel standard, but it would have to go back to not collect $200, and would have to recommence an extensive rulemaking proceeding to make that happen. If Prop 23 passes, and based on my experience with other initiative measures in the long and fertile history of California ballot box politics, we can expect a considerable amount of litigation to explore the parameters of Prop 23's effect, that is which climate change initiatives would be allowed to go forward based on independent legal authority and which would not. What about economic impacts of Prop 23 on the California economy? And a disclaimer here early on, as Dan revealed, I'm a late-in-life academic. Before that, I was a practicing attorney and litigator. I am not an economist. I don't even play one on television. So what I'm about to share with you is based on information I've received from economist friends and colleagues of mine. Our study concludes that it's really the long-term overall effects of AB 32 on California's economy and the job sector is uncertain and difficult to predict with any degree of certainty. But based on my lengthy discussions with economists and work with them, including on the ARB, Cal-EPA convened Economic Allocation Advisory Committee, I do have a couple of my own conclusions, and they are with respect to the effect of AB 32 implementation on the California economy. First, if AB 32 is implemented well by the Air Resources Board and other agencies of state government, it's likely to create incrementally more jobs in California than would otherwise be the case. Conversely, if the ARB and other state agencies implement AB 32 poorly, likely to create incrementally fewer jobs in the future than would otherwise exist. For reasons I'll get into in a moment, my own view, and I'm pretty confident of this, is that if AB 32 is allowed to go forward in November, that measure is likely to be implemented effectively and well by the ARB and the state of California. But what we do know on the economic front is that passage of Proposition 23 would result in a substantial setback to California's renewable energy commitment and a concomitant setback to the so-called green jobs sector of the California economy, a sector that's growing at 4 times the rate of California's economy as a whole. Indeed, in 2008, at the height of the current recession, the green jobs market in California grew by 2.5%, our study documents, as opposed to job loss in the California economy as a whole in 2008 compared to previous years. And finally, passage of Proposition 23 and suspension of AB 32 is likely to chill substantially the movement of the enormous amounts of venture capital that is currently moving and continues to move to California, especially for clean technology initiatives. Our study documents, again in 2008, some $3.3 billion came to California to serve those purposes. Now, there's been a lot of debate, and you've heard some today, about whether AB 32 is sound public policy and whether California is off on a bender of some sort and it's unwise. And in that regard, I thought I would go back to my own career history. My first job after law school in California was working for the then brand new California Energy Commission in the mid-1970s. And it seems to me, it's my opinion, that until AB 32 was enacted in 2006, the most visionary modern piece of environmental and energy legislation enacted in California in the last half century was the Warren-Alquist Act, enacted by the legislature in the mid-1970s. That did a number of major things. It required the state to do electrical demand forecasting itself for the first time, first in the nation really, rather than rely on private public utilities for that information. It also required California, again, first in the nation, to establish energy conservation standards for appliances, for residential buildings, for commercial buildings. Well, that's been about 35 years now, and what do we have to show for that? And I will tell you, back in the mid-70s when that legislation was being debated, we heard from many skeptics and many industry representatives the same views expressed today with respect to AB 32, how it's a job killer, how it's likely to impinge and depress the California economy. And the empirical evidence that has existed to date has shown directly to the contrary. That, and again, as documented in our study, as a result of the Warren-Alquist Act and the reforms created there in the mid-70s, California energy consumption has declined since 1970 by 18% at a time where energy consumption in the nation as a whole has increased steadily. $56 billion in energy savings have been achieved for the state of California and its residents, and as a result of those pioneering energy measures, the creation of some $1.5 million jobs. So in conclusion, looking to AB 32, moving from the Warren-Alquist Act of the mid-70s to the AB 32 enacted in the middle of the last decade, it seems to me that the climate change policy in the state of California in general, and AB 32, is one of the few bright lights and success stories we can point to at a time when California is being viewed within the state, nationally, and globally as a model of state government dysfunctionality. To the contrary, I believe that AB 32 was a visionary legislation when it was enacted in 2006, that the governor deserves a great deal of praise, both for his support of that legislation when it was pending and his vigorous efforts to support the implementation of it. And that Dan and his colleagues on the Air Resources Board similarly deserve a great deal of praise for their efforts to date to implement AB 32 through a process that has been timely and meeting very ambitious and demanding legislative deadlines, and a very transparent and inclusive regulatory process. And to suspend that legislative effort and that reform effort now strikes me as fundamentally unsound public policy, and that's especially true given the well-documented collapse of comprehensive national climate change legislation in the United States Congress, not only for this year, but if you believe the political prognosticators for the remainder of the current administration's term in office. To invoke a phrase from my own college days, the whole world is truly watching what California is doing on the climate change front, and it should continue to proceed as it has so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rick. So now we're going to hear another perspective. Ken Green is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Green has studied public policy involving risk, regulation, energy, and the environment at a series of nonprofit research institutions across North America. He holds a bachelor's degree in biology, a master's in molecular genetics, and a doctoral degree in environmental science and engineering, the latter from UCLA. He's authored numerous papers and reports, including a textbook for middle school students titled Global Warming, Understanding the Debate. He's testified before regulatory and legislative bodies at regional, state, and federal levels. His talk is titled The Many Flaws of AB 32. And I know he will not disappoint us.
Well, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good. Actually, I'm going to take the speaker's privilege and not talk about anything involving my title. No, just joking.
I don't believe that.
I will be speaking a bit about some of the flaws of AB 32. I'm also going to try to be the real world kind of person, since I work at think tanks. At think tanks, we actually are very lucky in a sense, because we don't have to spend our time publishing and perishing over empirical data and studies that are really, really deep in the weeds and with minutia. Instead, we actually get to circle around at 30,000 feet and are sometimes called upon to condense a huge policy issue into 3 minutes of testimony in front of hostile senators. And so I'm going to circle up that 30,000 foot level and talk about political economy globally. First, a couple of comments about what has been said so far. How many people think that SMUD is the worst acronym they've ever heard for an organization? If I ever worked at a place named SMUD, the first thing I would do is petition for a change of the name of the entity. Second thing I want to point out is one of the interesting things during the day here is we've heard some wonderfully sort of selective optimism. That is, there's huge optimism we can set this incredibly aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goal, a huge amount by the year 2030, but our opponents, those evil AB 23 people, are setting a completely unrealistic goal of us actually getting decent employment levels back to California, which has been done in the past. So there's a great deal of selective optimism in which assumptions are going to come to pass. Now to my prepared comments. I'd like to thank Rich Sexton and the Giannini Foundation for inviting me. I'd like to thank you, the stalwarts, for staying for the last panel of the day. I grew up here in California. I have family and friends here, and so and I may actually have dependents here that have to move back home with me. So I'm hoping that California's economy will improve, and I therefore have a vested interest in the economy of the state of California. I'm not an economist as well. I'm an environmental scientist, as you heard, though I do play an economist on TV now and then. My economics, such as it is, comes from exposure to having worked in think tanks with economists for about 16 years. Since I'm from AEI, everybody always wants to know, well, are you an evil climate denier? No, I'm a scientist. Do I believe greenhouse gases trap heat in the atmosphere? Yes. Simple physics says if you double greenhouse gas levels, you get about 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. If you pump in assumptions about feedback loops, you can get more. If you use computer models, you can get as much as you want. I don't place much faith in climate models, computer models, and I'm not selective. I don't place much faith in economic models. Anybody who places a lot of faith in economic models, and my apologies to all the great economists we've heard today, hasn't been paying attention to the utter crash of the economy, which was missed by virtually every economic model that exists. Both nationally and globally, nobody saw this coming. A 30% inflation value of housing was missed, and they're going to predict 2% growth in the year 2030 as a result of Bill. So I don't really go for the climate models. But anyway, so I would consider myself a climate realist. I think it's a real phenomenon? Yes. Is it sort of a normal environmental problem to challenge? Yes. Is it the catastrophe for which we have to overturn our world? No. So now specifically to AB 32. I want to start with first looking at the question of benefits, and then I'll go to costs. As the real world panel, I think we should be real and admit that AB 32 has no climate benefit to it whatsoever. California, as an economy, could shut itself off, and it wouldn't change the trajectory of global climate a whit. And that's because all the growth in emissions is going to be in the developed world, led by China, which is now the biggest emitter, biggest energy consumer, and is creeping up toward biggest economy. And they have made it eminently clear they do not intend to do anything that will significantly compromise their 9% and higher rates of economic growth until they have brought their people out of poverty. I actually happen to think that's a moral imperative I don't have a problem with. China will put up twice the emissions of the entire US by 2030 if they continue on their current trajectory, which is a very simple model, but that's about as complex a model as I get. If you've gone like this for 30 years, you might go that way for another 30. They're building 2 coal power plants a week, and people always talk about how successful they are, and I was talking about we could shut off California. Recently, China didn't make its energy targets, so you know what they did? They shut off a city. I don't think we're going to get to that kind of policy here in the United States. I hope not. But this is the situation. China and India and the developing world are going to dictate the pace of greenhouse gas emissions and therefore the pace of warming. And there's not much that we can do to affect that. Now, there's this question of whether California can be a first mover that inspires others to follow. In the past, California has managed to do that by basically policy blackmail, which is, look, federal government, if you don't raise your automobile fuel economy standards, we'll use our 10% market share, fragment with a few other states will fragment the automobile market and screw up the profits of your increasingly non-profitable automobile companies, and they went along. In the case of AB 32, as somebody said earlier, if you want to see a map of who supports and who doesn't support greenhouse gas controls, it's a red-blue map of politics, and the states in the middle are not going to follow along with what the coasts do. In fact, they're going to take advantage of the coasts' higher energy costs and hope that businesses will move where it's cheaper. And the same, of course, is true overseas. People always say China is waiting on the US example. The same as they are for women's rights, religious freedoms, and freedom of speech, property rights. And all those, we've set examples for a while for China. I'm thinking their example following mechanism, not so good. So if you, politically speaking around the world, if you look around the world and ask, well, what's the political economy of carbon controls, it's called turn around and run as fast as you can away. They're not even going to send government leaders to the negotiations in Cancun over the next round of international treaty talks. The various countries that have implemented a lot of renewable policies are backing away because they find the subsidies unsustainable economically. So if you want to know the political economy, it's a Monty Python runaway, right? Runaway, runaway. Now let's talk about the green tech thing, which everybody says, well, even if we don't get a climate benefit, we're going to have this great green tech boom here in California. Arnold Schwarzenegger's fond of this and so forth. Now, could California build, if it pumps enough subsidies and mandates into it, can it build a market in green tech here? For as long as it can afford it. But let's talk about some reality. Again, California has very strong, good, high pay, strong worker protections, strong environmental protections, high energy costs, and a large regulatory burden. China, the average total compensation for a manufacturing worker, 57 cents an hour. California last year, $14 an hour, 25 times higher than the Chinese wage. How long can California use subsidies to create a market to produce, actually manufacture green technology in one of the highest cost of business states in the country, for that matter, when you have people who are willing to work for 1/25 of what you're earning? More to the point, they also have cornered the market in the rare earth elements that are needed to build wind turbines, solar panels, and the high technology uses of magnets and so on. 95% of the rare earths market has been cornered by China. I don't think California is going to open a rare earths mine with its environmental laws anytime soon. But forget China. What's the wage rate in Mexico? $1 to $2 an hour. So I think people who believe there's going to be a big green tech boom here need to think back to the last time this was brought up. About 10 years ago, or actually now, gosh, I'm getting old, 15 years ago, there was talk about the EV1, the electric vehicle of the time. California had put in a zero-emission vehicle mandate, and I was arguing with the former head of Hughes Aircraft Company, who had taken over a battery consortium on a news outlet, McNeil Air, or one of the news programs, PBS news programs, and he said California was going to become the advanced battery manufacturing capital of the world. Last year, 98% of the world's advanced batteries were produced in China, Japan, and South Korea. So people promising you a green industry, one should be a little wary of the promises that are being made. Again, if you need examples, Spain, Germany, France, Italy, and the Czech Republic have all announced subsidy cuts to their wind and solar power. Estonia and the UK are verging on doing the same. If you haven't noticed, California's finances are not so great to begin with. Lumping in more subsidies may not be a grand plan. But you say, China's eating our lunch. They're building windmills all over the place, and solar power stations and so forth, which is true, because basically they're a dictatorship, and they don't have to worry about displacing people off their land, damming humongous gorges and dislocating millions of people. They can just do it. And furthermore, they do it with their cheap labor rate, low environmental standards, and all of the other advantages they have. Plus, it's great marketing. If you want to sell the West turbines, you put up turbines, right? Tons of them. In fact, they've been doing that. But last year, 30% of their turbines weren't even hooked up to their electricity grid. So now let's turn to the cost of AB 32. I'm not going to get into the numerical estimates. Like I said, my view of models is give me a computer model and enough input assumptions, and I'll make it sing in any song you want, Lady Gaga included. Models are wonderful theoretical tools if you don't take them too seriously, but as soon as they leave the policy, the research world, and people start saying, I want to sell you a car based on my computer model, go the other way. Here's the thing. From a first principles standpoint, energy is a fundamental input to production. We know this. Everything we do or use, everything we make, every service we consume uses an initial infusion of energy to create it. It uses more energy to get it to your market. You may use more energy to sustain it, and you almost certainly are increasingly using energy just to use it. So to argue that you can raise the cost of electricity or energy without raising the cost of everything else, I think is fundamentally silly. Now, you can argue that if there are benefits that outweigh those costs, but as we've heard before, if California is a solo mover or even a regional mover, you don't have benefits that outweigh the costs. Virtually every economist up here said the same thing. Unless the whole world goes, there's no benefit that outweighs the costs to California. And now, as an environmental scientist, I want to talk about something that's rarely discussed. Perversely enough, AB 32 can do more to harm the environment than it can do to help it. If it works, if it actually works, it will raise the cost of fossil fuels, and it will therefore create a de facto subsidy for renewables. But there's no such thing as benign energy, really. Renewables have huge environmental footprints. if you look at the manufacturing of the turbine, we're going to need tens to hundreds of thousands of wind turbines to displace a significant amount of coal power. Or in California's case, if for some reason you actually want to replace natural gas power with wind, you still need many, many hundreds to thousands of windmills. These are the size of the Statue of Liberty. They're going to be made in China, shipped here by diesel fuel, trucked by diesel trucks, need service roads to be put out where they are, and need power lines to bring you the power. Power lines increasingly opposed by environmental groups because they go through things like Anza Borrego State Park, for instance, to get power into San Diego. So, and then you take a look at biomass, biofuels, I mean. What do biofuels do? They make this patch of land more valuable to produce fuel than to produce food or to leave as ecosystem or to leave as grassland. They put a bounty on nature. The more of them you consume, the higher the bounty goes. And so you're talking about serious prospects of landscape devastation, ecosystem consumption. Wind power also not only harms the landscape, it minces birds and bats, causes local heating at the ground level, interestingly enough, underneath a big wind farm. It's a degree centigrade warmer at the ground, which has impacts on farmers and the farming community, who are supposedly the ones where you're going to put the windmills. And this is the best of all. At above 3% wind, because you have to fluctuate the backup power to account for the wind going up and down, you get more greenhouse gas emissions and more conventional pollutant emissions rather than less. Because we don't have the storage technology to balance the load with wind, and we don't have the super smart computerized national grid to do it either, and there's no appetite for building such a grid in this economy. Solar systems. I grew up camping in the Mojave Desert till it was made illegal because of endangered species. My guess is it's still mostly blocked off because of endangered species. And if it's not, I would find it amazing that they would say, you can't go out to the desert for any other use except for our favorite ones, which is, we'll hell with the rats, we'll build windmills, so we'll build solar power stations, which, by the way, require cooling water. Think about this. Cooling water and desert don't usually go along. So at the macro level, and finally you get back to the ultimate political economy of environmental beliefs. At the macro level, environmental protection is a luxury good. People are more concerned about it when they feel wealthy. They're less concerned about it when they feel poorer. If you look at the polls right now, you're seeing that play out as we go into recession. And so raising energy rates, losing some jobs, some productivity, et cetera, is precisely the way to get people to care less about the environment. If people really want others to clean up the environment, they want everybody to get rich as fast as they possibly can, especially the Chinese, because they have the low-hanging fruit of cleaning up the global environment. Finally, my conclusion is, I think if you care about the economy, you'd like to see AB 32 suspended. And if you care about the environment, you'd like to see AB 32 suspended. I would spend a couple of more minutes, but I'm not going to. I'll yield back my time to the speaker, to the moderator, and thank you for your attention.
Well, Ken, you didn't disappoint me.
I aim to please.
Thank you. So let me just start out with a few discussion, see if there's any reaction here between the panel. You know, I think one point that Ken raised, and it was raised in an earlier session also, is California being a hero or a sucker, to use Matt's words, in pursuing an AB 32 law and all of the policies and regulations and so on that go along with it. So let me just, Ken made lots of assertions, and we could probably debate lots of the details of it, but let's try to stick with some of these big points for now. And it's a legitimate one about California's role here, going, and part of it's economics, but it's partly how you think about the world, and how you think about how action actually takes place, and how policies actually spread and disseminate, and the role of the different groups of people as part of the globe. So let me just see if the other two people, Rick and Matt, would like to say anything about that.
Well, yeah, let me harken back to my point. I was born and raised in California and spent most of my life here. Right after law school in 1974, I ventured back to Washington, D.C. to work in Washington, D.C. For the federal government on energy issues, which were in the wake of the Arab oil embargo. So it was an interesting and exciting time. And I will tell you, the view nationally back then of California was what an exciting place to be. You know, innovation and leadership and environmental and other issues. And I think that was true then, and I think that remains true today. So I don't think that we're suckers, to go back to your question, and I forgot what the other one was.
Heroes.
Hero. I don't think we're suckers or heroes. I'd like to think we were leaders and visionaries, and that was certainly true, again, going back to control of conventional air pollutants and air quality reductions in the 60s and 70s. Is true with respect to foundational energy policy, energy conservation and forecasting standards, which started here in California, and it's been a model and it has spread nationally. And I have every reason to expect that if AB 32 goes forward and is implemented successfully, will serve as similar leadership across the country. I mean, one other example, the Pavley legislation, the air quality emission standards, have been adopted by 14 other states around the country that have the authority. Not only we got the authority in 1970 to enact more stringent vehicle emission standards in 1990. Amendments to the Clean Air Act, other states were allowed to opt into the California standards. Other states are voting with their feet and with their regulatory decisions, and as a result of that, that opt-in process, 14 other states accounting for close to half of the vehicle market share in the nation adopt the California standards. That in turn resulted in the so-called Rose Garden ceremony, a comprehensive climate change resolution announced by President Obama in April or May of 2009, which involved the federalizing effectively of the Pavley standards. So that's just one example in our very recent political history of how California has proven to be a leader in climate change policy, and I hope and expect that that will continue more broadly as AB 32 goes forward.
Thank you. I'd just add a quick point that again, we need, so I believe, so a theme in my Climatopolis book is that climate change is coming, and so there's going to be 7 billion people on the planet looking to decouple greenhouse gas emissions from achieving the good life that Ken alluded to. And there's also the challenge of peak oil. There's a question of whether you believe in that. And so moving forward, economists make a very big deal about directed technological change. What problems do our nerds focus on? I wish they'd focus on baldness. But and I believe that AB 32, in this world of uncertainty, where everyone keeps yelling about confidence and uncertainty, the Air Resources Board and our next governor will play a key role sending signals to venture capitalists that big money they put down is not money wasted. And I'm a big believer in a law of large numbers, that some of these ideas will work and will help the whole world.
Make two very quick points. The first is I would have to say the recent example of the nationalization of the Pavley automobile standards might have been more convincing if it weren't for the nationalization of the auto sector that sort of happened at roughly the same time. I think that may have had something to do with the ease of nationalizing those standards. But it's something I didn't mention earlier, which is a lot of the people who are pushing these green jobs are venture capitalists. This is a great point. Venture capital is flowing into California for the new green tech sector, right? Well, what do venture capitalists want at the end of the day? Profits. And they're perfectly happy if the government wants to create an artificial market for them to come in for technology that they could never sell on their own. They put in some seed money like Vinod Khosla into cellulosic ethanol. He's just happy as a pig in dirt when the government passes a standard that requires you to buy his fuel. Is this a noble endeavor? Venture capitalists are no more noble people than our government entities or any other corporate world. I mean, I think this, in fact, is a proof that there is a boondoggle going on. When you have venture capitalists coming and trying to do this stuff that can't stand on its own feet anywhere, you should look for what they're going to pull out of your state after they've put in their little seed money, how much they plan to pull out, because I can guarantee you they're not working for negative return on investment.
All right, if we haven't provoked you yet, you probably shouldn't be here. so let me open it up to the audience here for some discussions. Any questions?
Hi, Mikhail Scavallo here with California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance. Everyone talks about Prop 23 like all's lost if it happens to go through, but from the way we're looking at it with the U.S. EPA's endangerment finding, you know, we have 35 air districts who can regulate CO2 if things go through, and even so, ARB can regulate CO2 now independently of AB 32. It's just, I think that's why a lot of businesses have gone neutral on this issue, that there's nothing to be lost and nothing to be gained for them in this debate. Any comment?
Well, I'm not going to sit here like Chicken Little and say that if on November 2nd Prop 23 passes, the world as we know it will end. I think we're all, you know, hopefully we'll respond and adapt accordingly. There are all kinds of adaptation strategies. I guess this would be a political adaptation strategy. But you mentioned the U.S. EPA's recent endangerment finding. I guess a key point of clarification, perhaps departure from your assumption, that's under the existing Federal Clean Air Act. And a lot of people from, I think, from Ken's perspective all the way to the most liberal environmentalists take the view that the Clean Air Act is at best a very imperfect tool to address climate change. Right now, at the federal level, it's the only game in town, given the collapse of climate change legislation. But I, for one, am not confident that the current Clean Air Act is the best vehicle. And again, I've got a lot of friends in the development community who, on Capitol Hill, have testified to that effect. And my guess is if hypothetically Prop 23 is enacted, California doesn't go forward on AB 32, and we have activity on the Clean Air Act regulatory front, there will be a plethora of industry-brought litigation to challenge whatever climate change regulatory strategies are adapted by U.S. EPA and other federal agencies under that statute.
I was actually talking more about local air quality management.
You want to comment? Just that's an interesting. Those are interesting. I think you're right. There's plenty of backup power at the state local level to regulate greenhouse gases without AB 32, and many panelists today have pointed that out. Regardless of the wisdom of it, just by the way, for the record, my view is, I've written before, that if you really want near-term greenhouse gas reductions, a revenue-neutral carbon tax is the way to go. I have increasingly become convinced that a revenue-neutral carbon tax is the next thing to a unicorn, because it's something you'll never ever see the government do. But nonetheless, it would be the way to go. Just two comments. One, there is a question of whether AB 23 could in fact be a bellwether. So, you know, I wouldn't, if I were those pushing AB 32, I wouldn't be so comfortable that AB 23, that the Prop 23 wasn't the beginning of a retreat, of a tide, especially if things happen in the elections, midterm elections that some people are predicting. And also, just a quick correction, at the federal level, actually you have the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, which has now been used in a greenhouse gas context, the Clean Water Act, which can also be used to regulate greenhouse gases. There's any number of federal regulations, even if they push EPA off regulating greenhouse gas emissions, that's not going to stop it from being regulated.
Yes, Professor Jarvis.
Oh yeah, Tu Jarvis, University of California, Davis, Agricultural Resource Economics. As I sat, and this to Ken's points, I come from Kansas, small town and Republican area. I have a lot of family living back there that I engage in political discussion quite frequently. And I get a lot of the same types of arguments. A lot of facts that are put together in ways that sound very persuasive, but which I think, going back to Professor Sperling's comment, often it seems to be, in fact, are not quite right. And I want to start just with your first comment, at least the first comment that really registered with me when you said, if we double CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, parts per million, we'll get about a 1.5% increase in temperature. Now, my memory of looking at the climate models, and this is from memory, not precision, is that the ICPP models suggest that if we double from the pre-industrial level of about 280, and we're about 390 now, so if we get to 560, the confidence interval is someplace between about 1.7 and 2.7.
Actually, well, okay, first what I actually said was, I think that if you look at just the basic physics, if you double the concentration of greenhouse gases from the pre-industrial levels, you'll see a 1.5 degree centigrade warming of the climate, approximately. The IPCC gives a range. I was a reviewer, by the way, for the third assessment report, the IPCC's third assessment report, the science volume. The IPCC gives a wide range of sensitivity estimates to the climate. 1.5 degrees, the most often cited is 1.5 degrees to 4.5 degrees centigrade. That, by the way, is a range which hasn't become more certain over time. In fact, it hasn't changed for about 100 years. It's acknowledged in the report. The 1.5 range is the range simply if you just count the straight physics without assuming water vapor feedbacks, without assuming cloud temperature feedbacks, without putting in any of the assumptions of the responses of plants. That's just as if the Earth was a black body in space, and that's what you'd get. So that's sort of to clarify my point.
Well, okay, my sense is that among the various estimates of what you're suggesting there is obviously you're not doubling from where you are now, you're doubling from where you were in the pre-industrial period. Mm-hmm. You're already well along in that. Most of the predictions indicate from my reading is that you have a very substantial difficulty even imposing very severe measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the future, that you hold it to a doubling. Now, the 1.5%
degree.
Most of the data, at least that I read, also suggests that there are real questions about, we have very substantial absorptive capacity. Obviously, the world will change, but not catastrophically. But once you get up around 2 degrees centigrade, it begins to become really unclear what's going to happen. And so when I come back to sort of looking at these various sorts of positions from a political viewpoint, I would come back to the issue of saying, yes, what is California trying to do? Clearly, as I think you indicated, I would agree, California is not going to have a significant impact directly on climate change, nor is the United States, which is say 25% of the whole. We can have an impact, but not nearly as much as we would like. Certainly, however, if the United States and China together, that's 50% right there. So what we'd presumably like to do is a demonstration effect. We'd like to believe that if we can show that we can have an impact on greenhouse gases without a demonstrably negative impact on our economy, on the local economy, that would be very strong evidence to the United States, and hopefully not only the United States, but to the rest of the world, that this is a policy which comes at relatively low cost, which can achieve substantial benefits in the long run for the world and for humanity and the like. What strikes me about that is that here California is willing to take this leadership position to at least try a policy. And AB 23, Proposition 23, from all that we know, is primarily financed from outside interests, which suggests that this is really an ideological battle. This is a battle about individuals from outside who don't even want to see the effort from California, because if it succeeds, there's no real damage to the rest of the world because we will have succeeded in showing that it works at relatively limited cost, but it is ideologically unacceptable to many individuals. And that is what it seems to me to be. This is an ideological battle about whether we can allow a state like California to try something which might succeed.
May I respond just real quick? Because I know we want to take other questions. There are two things. One should be careful what one wishes for, because if you don't demonstrate that greenhouse gases can be reduced without significant economic impact, you could set the exact opposite example you want to set. The second point I would make is this: there is a great deal of, I know, high dudgeon about outsiders trying to skew the California political process. Given that California is trying to blackmail the federal process blatantly, I think is a hilarious bit of hypocrisy. It's like, we as California want to tell you in Kansas how to use energy and generate energy, but we don't want you in Kansas telling us in California what to do. I see a certain one-way standard there.
I think we highlighted some of the issues there. Okay, where did I see where's the microphone?
Over down here in the front there.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I think that one of the issues is, I really think that that California is divided. you demonized venture capitalists, and I think that you made a mistake between venture capitalists to Wall Street, because they are two different individuals. California actually, most of Northern California at least, and Los Angeles, are basically survive and succeed because of the computer industry, biotech industry. These are, I don't know if these are industries that are doing quite well. And to some extent, I think the model in California, including movie, is the model of venture industry. The rest of the world is imitating it. So the gamble that some people have is price of energy goes up. We don't know about climate change. Price of energy goes up. We need alternative energy. Some of the alternative energy, even the one in the Midwest, even corn biofuel, not to mention the biofuel in Brazil is successful. There will be more need to energy in the future. What we are doing here, we basically come to California and say, the U.S., and believe, I don't blame Obama for taking over General Motors. I blame the fact that for many years we really didn't realize that prices go up and change taste, and it's a combination of capital and unions. It's all together. It's a combination of, and basically, let's really develop a system where we shift the system forward, and then our creativity will move us forward. And I think this, to me, is the model. So to some people, if you really believe that the strength of California is creativity, and we can really develop systems that will basically develop the technology, we won't produce the stuff. It will be produced in China, like they produce our iPod and they produce everything else, so in Kansas. We wouldn't produce it here. And maybe it's elitist vision of California, but to some extent it's the vision that people have in California. But if we don't do it, we would lose the race. The fact that Germany now is dominating in many areas that we should have been dominating is because of relative advantage. So to some extent, what we really want to do, we want to be able to have a little bit more expensive energy, a little bit more regulation, because sooner or later, other countries may need it, and even if they don't need it, the energy pricing will push things forward. So it's really for the self-interest of California. That's my feeling.
Oh, wait a minute, we have a, right over here. Go ahead, yes.
My name is Dorothy. I'm an agricultural real estate appraiser. And in the first chart this morning, it showed that agriculture was being affected by the pie chart. It was 9%, and energy or electricity was 23%. And then, but then when the energy person gave her speech, agriculture was in there at 6% of her part. So, and no one spoke on transportation. And I would guess that agriculture is a big piece of that transportation portion because we have to get our crops to and from facilities and to and from distribution outlets and to and from supermarkets. So I'm wondering if agriculture is going to be affected more largely than anybody has considered, and what the effect is going to be on food prices.
Well, I think, I don't know the full answer to that, but in the inventories, they do try to separate out the transportation from the agriculture, but as you point out, there's lots of protocol that are developed to do that. But I do believe the freight part of it, the larger freight movements are in the transportation side, but some of the local agricultural shipments and so on would be local. But it does point out, part of the challenge, just one little idea that we haven't really emphasized is that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and this is a lot of academics and researchers in the audience, and to a large extent, that's a big challenge for the research community, is to be able, we can talk at the, many people like to talk at the 30,000 foot level, including me, I enjoy it, but if we don't understand at the very granular level, the detail level, what's really happening and how to manage it, then we are going to fail. So that might be one of the flaws of AB 32 is, in many cases we don't have the kind of high quality data that we need. But we are working towards it.
Also, this is a point where we actually agree, which is we've heard a lot of people today say if AB 32 is done well, and I ask myself, how often does government do things really, really that well, and do we have enough data? Now, there is data on the effect that corn ethanol had, for example, on world food prices a couple years ago. Unfortunately, the estimates range from like 5% to 85%, and it's all based on whatever somebody assumes about, the assumptions they pump into their economic model about how much it displaced fuel, fuel use and so forth, or crop use, crop growth and so on. So I agree with Dan in this case. We don't really have the kind of resolution we'd like, which is why it's not only easy to stay at the 30,000 foot level, it's hard to get down to the -1.
So Ken, I would point out that given that we do need some government agency to administer any of these policies and laws, my experience with CARB is that that's about as good a one as you can get. It is, and it's a model in many, it's much less politicized than EPA as an example.
My ex, who is 6 feet tall, works for ARB, so I won't argue with that.
Okay, so, all right, where's the microphone? All right.
Hi, again, I'm David Rolenholtz from UC Berkeley. I just want to give a little bit of an answer to this question because it's a very interesting one, and I have done some research on energy dependence in California agriculture. I can tell you that agriculture is headed for a big challenge, and it's a very useful example in this particular context because we have to remember we're not just talking about the future cost of abatement technologies and clean technologies. We're also talking about very uncertain energy prices going forward, and when we saw energy prices, I'm talking about fuels, transportation fuel prices rise very sharply a few years ago. The trucking industry that served agriculture, that delivered 60% of the salad greens in the United States in January, was encountering enormous challenges trying to remain profitable. Particular categories of low-value, high-mass products like dairy have been gradually migrating away from urban areas because, as you may know, if you look at the 100-year balance sheets of dairies, it's all about real estate capital gains. It's not really about selling their products. And they've migrated away from suburban development and made profits by doing that. We've been importing dairy from New Mexico and Arizona, but what you're going to see is a reverse migration of those products. There'll be adjustment costs associated with that, which will be incorporated in the prices of these things. But let's remember that all industries in California face a choice between an uncertain future of what I would expect to be drastically escalating fossil fuel prices, but never mind, you can all have your own expectations about that. A choice between that and technology adoption for energy efficiency. And we're going to see that agriculture is really going to be at the leading edge of this, almost regardless of what policies are mandated for technology adoption. It's a very important choice that faces agriculture.
Yeah, and that inspires me to think, at Air Resources Board, which is carrying out many of these policies and programs, I would characterize that among the senior leadership, it's very clear that the intention is to be a model and a leader, and that there's no misconception about the effect of what AB 32 policies are going to be. And that I would even go so far as to say that the perception is, the understanding is that if the rest of the country does not adopt cap and trade or does not adopt something similar to that within a few years, then it probably doesn't make sense for California to be continuing to move ahead with it. So there are those, in government, people are not naive or stupid about this. And, but it is part of the discussion. You might be skeptical. You say, well, once a law or program's put in place, it's there forever. But I do think that, we are being fairly sophisticated about it and making judgments about how this whole process rolls out, California, nationally, internationally. It's messy, it's flawed, but, does anyone have a better approach? All right, where's the microphone? Okay. Yeah, keep your hands up for a second so I can see where to, if you're interested in talking.
From a free market perspective, my name is Jeremy Cook. I'm a geologist and consultant. We see the private sector adopting sustainability strategies at a very exciting rate. Private sector is taking on initiatives, and I think they look at air quality and air regulations as just that, as a regulation. When you fold this into the broader sustainability perspective, there's more value being defined within business strategy by looking at it at a broader perspective. So I think But just looking at it, just air and just regulation, I think you cut out some of the value. When you start listening to perspectives on just air, I think you miss out, because there's also water. There's going to be, and how water and air relate to energy use. And companies that realize that and innovate around those challenges are going to be the leaders of the next global economy. It's those that might take the perspective of Mr. Green that are going to be stuck in the previous economy, still fighting for those jobs of the past. I come from a state, also like the gentleman from Kansas, the state of Louisiana, and they're going to be struggling with that economy for a long time and the damages of it. So I'm excited to be here in the leader state of California.
Thank you.
Dan? A quick comment, which I'm a rabid free marketer myself, but to claim that anything coming out of a regulatory initiative like Reg 32 is a free market outcome is incorrect. Market, when they talk about market-based mechanisms, yes, you can create a market. I can set up a market in cigarettes in prison. In fact, it's pretty easy to do that. Just put people who smoke in prison. That doesn't make it a free market, right? You have created a market which otherwise wouldn't exist. So you have to keep separate the idea of free market and market. They're not really the same thing. And one other comment, Dan, with regard to something you said, programs are irreversible to the extent you create entrenched interests. And so I'd be interested in how ARB is going to tell people after they've given out many billions of dollars worth of carbon permits that people hold now as a real value on their books, that they're going to devalue them.
Certainly a good question to pursue. All right, back there.
My name is Maggie Cara from UC Berkeley. Just a quick comment for Richard Frank. I just want to thank you for the insight you brought regarding the energy efficiency initiatives in the 70s. I think that too often we treat anything related to climate change as completely unprecedented. But we do have precedents and we do have history that we can look back to, and I think that those insights are extremely valuable and wise to look back on.
Yeah, and that does highlight, the fact that with AB 32, it is a goal that it's understood to be aligned with other goals, and that includes oil import reduction, pollution, and part of it is understanding of how well are these policies aligned, and we probably we talk about that a lot, but we haven't really done a good job of being able to quantify it and understand those relationships. So that energy efficiency is part of that. Yes.
Can I belatedly just talk a little bit about very recent political history, and we talk about hypocrisy, and there's probably some on both sides of this debate, but I remember in the debates over AB 32 back in the spring and summer of 2006, it was the business community that really insisted upon a so-called market-based system as a key component of cap and trade, and indeed Governor Schwarzenegger conditioned his support of the legislation upon inclusion of authority that would at least allow ARB to adopt a cap and trade program. So to see some of the same business interests now so vigorously oppose and contest cap and trade when it is their same lobbyists who insisted upon that as a component of the AB 32 back in 2006 strikes me as intellectually inconsistent.
Rick, yeah, if I can make a comment, I'm glad you drew the distinction you did, though, between business people, because this is a paper I'm going to write. There's been this meme going around that, conservatives are the ones who wanted pricing, and now they're running away from pricing, and which is really silly in many ways. But when you talk about manufacturers or the business community, business is not ideological. Business is about making a profit, and so it's a key distinction, which is, do conservatives, were they still, for the right pollutant, implemented the right way, support a cap and trade system? Almost certainly. In this case, they don't necessarily believe that's the case. But business interests and conservatives are as often at odds as they are, agreed.
Duly noted.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions back there.
Hello, Stacy Sullivan, Sustainable Conservation. I wanted to follow up on something that Matt brought up, sort of and sort of going off to sort of riffing off of something that Ken said, which was, I think that there's certainly a growing awareness that the problems of environmental degradation, or whatever you want to call it, and the problems of the existence of poverty go hand in hand. And I think, the idea that the creation of that people who are less concerned about just the bare necessities of getting through life are going to be more likely to think about maybe larger context issues. However, I think Matt raised a very interesting point where he said one of the effects of global warming, at least I think I heard him say this, is the impacts of climate change on the ability of developing countries to generate wealth. And when you think about the kind of dislocations that have been talked about in terms of water supply, in terms of various other things, it seems to me like that if you've got an interesting sort of conundrum where on one hand you say wealth creation is necessary in order to provide for environmental benefit, but at the same time the environmental problem impedes the ability of the developing world to engage in that kind of wealth development. So isn't there in fact a developmental economic argument for addressing climate change in an aggressive way in order to make sure that that growth can occur?
Just two quick comments. One is, no matter how aggressive we are about greenhouse gas emission reductions, if one believes, even in the low-end scenarios, the greenhouse gases already put up into the air and before we can change course are going to bring forth some of those impacts on the developing countries. So if you really want to help Africa or the developing countries quickly, you need to help them build resilience and build their economy quickly. But I mean, you're right. There's a tension between what's called the environmental Kuznets curve, which is that as people get more wealthy, they become more concerned about their environment, more willing to fix it, and then environmental degradation declines over time. It's not going to be true automatically and everywhere at all times. There will be situations where, yeah, you get hit with a flood or you have environmental problems that are so strong in one area that you can't begin to climb the curve. You're stuck at the bottom of the curve.